Thank you so much, Fabian. Howdy to all. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to give you some examples of crisis management from developed countries from a food security perspective today. Slide. So we start with three quick disclaimers first. The general one, that the findings and comments are my own and not representative of the US government. Secondly, I would note that the examples here are drawn very heavily from the OECD Agricultural Resilience Workstream, including these publications that I contributed to before joining ERS earlier this year. And lastly, I'd note that the examples are not exhaustive. Many countries have in place the measures I will cover, not just those highlighted. Slide. A quick roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the topic before moving right into the examples across all of the disaster risk management cycle, before ending with some lessons learned. Slide. So we start with the background on food security. It's important to first clarify what we mean by food security because it has four different dimensions and crisis management can affect all of them. First, we have availability, and that relates to the physical supply of food, whether from production, trade, or stocks. Secondly, access. This means both physical access, can people get to the food, and economic access, can people afford the food? Third, utilization. Is the food safe? Is it nutritious? Does it meet dietary needs? And finally, stability. Is there food all of the time, or are there seasonal or other interruptions in food supplies? In developed countries, most of these would not typically be an issue. The biggest problem in crisis and out of it is economic access to food. And in crisis situations, supply chain interruptions can affect food stability also, so these are really going to be the two components that we'll focus on today. Looking at the whole topic of crisis management in developed countries from a food security perspective, there's somewhat limited scholarship looking at this interplay in developed countries because food security is not typically jeopardized by emergency situations. Countries have emergency response services to ensure that affected citizens have physical access to food. Market impacts are typically small, and trade acts as a buffer to mitigate short-term shocks. For more systemic economic emergencies, countries do have social safety net policies in place. But particularly after the 2007-8 food price crisis, many countries took a critical look at their food policies to see how prepared they were for future crisis situations. And we're seeing renewed calls again to look at domestic food security after COVID. I'd note that some of these calls do come from interest groups who advocate domestic food sovereignty and who would benefit from such an approach. But little research in the area doesn't mean that we're flying blind, because we can pool our knowledge on this topic by looking at what's been learned specifically in these three spheres to draw conclusions. I can't get into all of the lessons in this short time, but two things stand out that will be repeated in the presentation. First, the importance of acting swiftly to keep crisis from cascading and causing larger economic damage. And secondly, food insecurity in developed countries is largely driven by income. Slide. Since effective crisis management involves activities throughout the risk management cycle, I'm going to give some examples of measures at each stage. Slide, please. First, we start with identification, assessment, and awareness. All three activities are usually encompassed in national risk assessment and strategic plans, and most developed countries have these. However, the extent to which they incorporate or consider food security is mixed. Iceland has a national strategic plan that outlines responsibilities, but it doesn't have a strategic plan on food security. In Japan, natural disaster risk management is actually one of the 8 focus priorities of Japanese agricultural policy, including a mandate to prepare for a stable food supply during unforeseen circumstances. And in the UK, DEFRA has done some specific assessments of food security, which considered availability, food chain resilience, and household food security. Some countries have taken that basic risk assessment further with more detailed stock taking and scenario analysis efforts focused on food security. A series of reports were carried out in the Netherlands from 2008 forward, identifying potential risks like climate change and trade risk, analyzing scenarios, and proposing risk mitigating strategies. This UK report instead looks at food security from a business continuity management perspective. That is, will the firms that supply our food be able to cope with crisis? Other countries go further still to consider not just the current risk environment, but also what future risks are developing or could develop through foresight and horizon scanning. For example, Finland has a dedicated foresighting program and a standing government foresight group. Every 5 years or so, they even released a government report on the future. The Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency also carries out strategic foresighting, including on risks that could impact food security. Slide. Once risks have been identified, countries then take steps to prevent or mitigate their impacts. Some of the most obvious examples with respect to food security are the management of outbreaks and the spread of animal and plant disease. In Australia, strict biosecurity rules prevent outbreaks of plant and animal diseases, including restrictions on imports of products that may bring disease into Australia. In the Netherlands, their Animal Health Fund links together public and private actors, which outlines their respective responsibilities for monitoring, preventing, reporting, and control. Other preparedness initiatives have looked at supply chain resilience. Japan's most recent 3-year emergency plan mandated securing emergency power and creating business contingency plans for wholesale markets, and also formulating response plans and installing emergency backup power for dairies and slaughterhouses. Some initiatives have focused on the need for collaborative preparedness. Canada's emergency management framework for agriculture prioritizes prevention and mitigation to stop emergencies from escalating, emphasizing shared responsibility to mitigate risk and take collaborative action. Slide. On preparedness, there's a need to ensure all actors, not just the government, have plans in place. The government can have a role in supporting preparedness of other actors as well. For the public sector, most country governments do have strategic plans for critical risks, as noted above. Some countries go further to identify food and agriculture as critical infrastructure sectors with specific mechanisms, networks, and contingencies for emergencies. This happens in Australia, Canada, and the USA. Countries can organize drills and scenario exercises to raise awareness and test drive procedures in the absence of a crisis. Germany conducts a LUCEX National Strategic Crisis Management Exercise Drill every 2 years, and this involves government staff, operators of critical infrastructure, and volunteer organizations. In the US, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, carries out national-level exercises every 2 years, and in addition, the food and agricultural critical infrastructure sector also participates in exercises and tabletop scenarios. The outcomes of these exercises provide feedback on how to improve protection of critical infrastructure and help to create awareness and horizontal and vertical cooperation. Some countries do keep emergency food reserves. Germany has kept emergency stores of wheat, oats, and rye under the Federal Grain Reserve Authority since the Cold War. And Israel keeps a strategic reserve of essential food products, but quantities and costs are classified. The importance of private sector preparedness should also not be overlooked, and I'll give you 2 examples here. The private sector can participate in critical infrastructure networks. Under the U.S. Food and Agricultural Critical Infrastructure Setup, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan guides how both government and private sector owners and operators work together to manage risk. The plans are developed and implemented collaboratively, and the Food and Ag Plan in particular emphasizes the importance of public-private partnerships, given that food and ag critical infrastructure is almost entirely under private ownership. Other countries encourage business continuity management. Australia offers organizational resilience checklists online for businesses. France has offered a vulnerability reduction program for businesses in the Loire Valley. And the UK actually developed a business continuity for dummies manual to help firms, particularly SMEs, develop business continuity management plans and address potential vulnerabilities. Slide, please. Citizen preparedness can also mitigate the impacts of crisis on food security. In lieu of panic buying and stockpiling, as we saw under COVID, governments can and do encourage citizens to be prepared for emergencies. And one aspect of this preparedness is emergency kits. In Australia, the government advocates that citizens keep 14 days worth of food on hand. In New Zealand, it's 3 days or more. But in order to get this message across, creative risk communication campaigns have sought to reach more people. In the US, the Centers for Disease Control launched a zombie preparedness website to encourage better all hazards preparedness, including keeping emergency food supplies. Another tool that raises risk awareness and encourages preparedness more generally are drills, such as those observed in Japan and Mexico. Slide. While the preceding activities cut across many different risks of potential threats, actual response measures for food security are highly dependent upon the emergency in question, as well as the mechanisms through which food security is or could be affected. The response is going to depend on how big the event is, the length of the crisis, and how pervasive it is. So for this reason, here we're going to consider two types of emergencies. First, an isolated natural hazard like a flood, and second, a cascading emergency, specifically responses to COVID. We start with slide please, thank you. We start with just some general comments on how these types of crises relate to food security. The characteristics. There can be damage to food supplies or production. People can be cut off from food supplies, and these interruptions are typically short-term. And the policy responses coordinate with that, to restore productive capacity, to address food supply chain issues, and to provide emergency food. Slide. We start with restoring productive capacity. In order to minimize impacts to income of farmers and rural areas, stakeholders need to get back to business. Italy has prioritized business continuity and disaster response. During the 2016-17 earthquakes, responders worked with farmers to ensure there was minimal interruption to animal rearing activities, with solutions including installing modular housing close to animals rather than mandating that farmers stay in larger shelters. In New Zealand, rural support trusts assist farmers and their families to overcome adverse events. They provide information, links to assistance, stress management services, and work with emergency services to deliver assistance. With respect to supply chain issues, countries have noted the benefits of regular communication between stakeholders and governments to address any issues affecting or potentially affecting supply chains. Italy developed an app, the Veterinary Information System for Non-Epidemic Emergencies, that allows producers to communicate with emergency responders to report issues and get assistance. In the US, FEMA coordinates with the private sector through the National Business Emergency Operations Center, which is a two-way virtual platform for information sharing between public and private stakeholders. It's important to also recognize the need to repair damaged infrastructure and the role of trade to buffer local impacts to food prices. Slide. When either physical food access or stability is impacted, countries provide emergency food, particularly to displaced people. In Japan, the Ministry of Agriculture sends food and beverage supplies to shelters based on the number of people evacuated in each prefecture. They don't wait for requests from local governments. In the US, USDA has various disaster nutrition programs. For example, local disaster relief organizations can request that existing USDA food inventories, such as for school meals, be redirected through state distributing agencies for mass feeding during emergencies. And states can also request access to Disaster Supplemental Nutrition Assistance, or DSNAP, through which disaster-impacted households can get 1 month of benefits through an electronic benefits transfer card. These benefits are issued within 72 hours. Volunteer organizations also play a role in many countries and should not be overlooked. Slide. While food security typically impacts from natural hazards are usually isolated and short-term, cascading crisis that leads to large economic shocks can have big food security implications. Typically, availability is not affected, although stability can be an issue if supply chains are interrupted, as seen during COVID. The biggest impact to food security comes from loss of economic access, and I have two charts from ERS that really illustrate that point. In past recessions, so the gray bars in the graph, you see that food security increases, the top 3 lines, sometimes lagging a rise in unemployment, which is the bottom line, and sometimes concurrently increasing. Slide. You see the same story with expenditures on food assistance programs. Periods of recession are followed by increases in food assistance, particularly SNAP. Slide. Because we're not talking about availability, but instead stability and access, policy responses largely fall into addressing those needs. Stability, ensuring trade and that supply chains are functioning normally, and access through social safety nets. Slide. Let's look at this through the lens of COVID response. I would note that nearly all of these supply chain functionality examples come from the 2020 OECD Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Report, so feel free to refer back to that. To make sure that supply chains function normally, countries pursued information and coordination initiatives. There was a huge rise in online platforms for a variety of reasons in many countries, as outlined here. International coordination was also important, as Leanne stressed earlier. Particularly the Agricultural Market Information System contributed to food market transparency and policy response coordination. There were also initiatives to improve government coordination with the private sector. They were launched in Canada, Denmark, and Mexico to monitor the food chain, discuss issues, and policy response coordination. Specific initiatives to improve logistics were also noted. In the EU, green lanes were set up to ensure goods could travel, as was mentioned earlier, and regulatory flexibilities were also put in place. In Canada, trucks and plane crews transporting goods were exempt from travel bans. The EU allowed the acceptance of electronic documents to facilitate trade, and Portugal reduced or suspended physical border checks. Labor is fundamental to supply chain functionality. In fact, Huff et al. 2015 estimated that in a multi-wave pandemic, it would have large negative implications for U.S. food security because of impacts to labor, because sick or affected employees would be absent throughout the supply chain. So policies that keep workers safe, by consequence, help to ensure food security. Worker safety or health initiatives were put in place in Canada, where they announced a program where support would be provided to employers or foreign workers to help cover the costs of complying with mandatory 2-week quarantines for workers upon their arrival into Canada. In Denmark, they extended working hours in slaughterhouses to be able to maintain production without compromising worker safety. And in Spain, they limited the number of agricultural workers that could be transported per vehicle in order to minimize social contact. Seasonal worker availability was prioritized in France and Norway. France launched campaigns to recruit atypical workers as seasonal farm labor, and Norway allowed workers to extend their residency permits. Slide. So given that income is the primary driver of food security, effective social safety nets can be critical to minimize food security impacts from crisis. During COVID, income support was offered in Canada, France, and Ireland, amongst others. Food benefits were offered in other countries. Physical food assistance in the form of food baskets or parcels or boxes were delivered to needy families or vulnerable citizens. In both the UK and the US, monetary food assistance was also given. In the UK, digital supermarket vouchers were given to low-income families, and the US both increased the budget to allocating food assistance programs, and states could also apply for a special pandemic EBT card program so that kids who normally receive free or reduced price school meals could have those benefits added to an EBT card. Food banks were a part of the response as well. In the Czech Republic, food destined for schools was redirected to food banks instead. And in Portugal, the government supported the distribution of fruits and vegetables through the National Food Bank Network. Slide. Because most crises that have big impacts on food security in developed countries typically impart little physical damage, recovery and reconstruction and the desire to build back better refers mostly to examining processes, learning lessons, and improving systems to be better prepared for the next crisis. The key here is really learning lessons, and here are some of the key questions. Most countries carry out reviews, although many are ad hoc. New Zealand has done ad hoc reviews of certain emergencies, for example. In Ireland, their guidelines for coordinating a national level of emergency response do include a systemic post-crisis review process and template for documenting lessons learned. Slide. So what are our own lessons learned then? First of all, effective crisis management for food security starts with risk identification, assessment, and awareness. I note that countries are doing specific analysis with respect to food security, but many of these exercises seem to be one-off, undertaken after the 2007-8 food price crisis. But the risk environment is constantly changing and evolving, and risk assessment should evolve too, including continuous monitoring to identify new threats and consider how previously identified threats have changed. Second, a proactive approach addresses threats and vulnerabilities in advance to prevent emergencies from escalating to crisis. Countries observed to take a variety of measures in these areas, and these are often informed by their individual circumstances. Third, response. Acting quickly can prevent emergencies from escalating and can limit negative food security implications. This includes having emergency plans and response networks in place, engaging networks for public-private coordination, and having safety net programs that can be scaled up to meet needs. Fourth, evaluation. There's a need to learn from past mistakes and experiences. Evaluations are key tools to do better next time. And the last word, stakeholders do periodically raise the specter of food nationalism and self-sufficiency as a means to food security. But as pointed out by Leanne, these policies involve large trade-offs and can actually hurt food security, particularly if the policies raise domestic food prices. So with that, I leave you with some references that come from the body of OECD work that's looking at these issues.